The little black girl knocked beside the cargo office, telling the biker someone forced her mom into a locked room. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was a warm and quiet evening at the cargo office, just off Route 68. The air was thick with the smell of engine oil, the hum of idle trucks, and the rustling of papers. But everything changed in a matter of seconds when a small figure appeared out of nowhere. A little black girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, was running toward the biker group standing beside their motorcycles. Her face was streaked with tears, and her tiny feet pounded the gravel path, each step filled with desperation. She stumbled to a halt, eyes wide with panic, and grabbed the nearest biker's jacket. "Please help. Please," she gasped, barely able to get the words out. Someone forced my mom into a locked room. You have to come with me." The bikers exchanged confused glances, unsure of what to make of the situation. But there was no time for hesitation. The urgency in her voice was enough to convince them that this wasn't just some childish cry for attention. This was real. "Take a breath, kid," Jack, the leader of the crew, said as he knelt down in front of her. His voice was calm, but his eyes told a different story. He was trying to assess the situation, to figure out if this was some kind of setup. But something in the girl's face, her fear, her trembling hands, made him believe her. "Where is she?" he asked. "Where's your mom?" The little girl pointed shakily down the street, where the fading light from the setting sun barely illuminated an old, weather-beaten house at the end of the road. "That way," she said, her voice cracking. "They took her. I couldn't stop them." Jack stood up and turned to his crew. They knew what was at stake here. They weren't just a group of bikers. They were a family, and family came first. Without another word, Jack motioned for the others to follow him. The roar of the engines filled the air as they revved their bikes and lined up, ready to ride. Jack could feel the weight of the promise he had just made to this scared little girl. He had no idea what they were about to walk into, but he knew one thing. They weren't going to leave without that girl's mom. They had to get there fast. The girl climbed onto the back of Jack's bike, her small arms wrapped tightly around his waist. The group of bikers took off, leaving the quiet office behind, their engines rumbling in unison. As they rode down the street, the girl pointed again, her voice barely audible over the sound of the bikes. "That's where they took her," she said, her finger trembling as it pointed toward a small, crumbling house at the end of the block. "Please hurry. They're going to hurt her." Jack didn't need any more convincing. He gunned the engine, speeding toward the house. The others followed closely behind, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. They were getting closer, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why would someone force a woman into a locked room? And who were these people? What kind of danger were they about to face? Jack didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing. They were about to find out. The roar of the engines grew louder as Jack led the convoy down the narrow road, the last light of the day fading behind them. The little girl, her small arms wrapped tightly around Jack's waist, pressed her face into his back, her body trembling. He could feel her fear, the desperation she was carrying. There was no turning back now. They were committed. As they neared the house, Jack's gut twisted with unease. The house loomed ahead, its faded paint and sagging porch making it look abandoned. Yet, the flickering lights inside suggested otherwise. The convoy came to a sudden halt. The bikers dismounted quickly, their boots hitting the gravel with a purpose. Jack scanned the surroundings, trying to assess the best approach. The house was eerily quiet, but Jack could feel the tension thickening in the air. "Stay sharp," he whispered to the crew. "We don't know what we're walking into." The little girl, still clinging to Jack's back, shakily pointed to the front door. "That's where they took her," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Please hurry." Jack gave a quick nod, signaling to his crew. They moved in formation, silent and efficient. One by one, the bikers lined up on either side of the house, ready to storm in if needed. Jack approached the front door slowly, his hand on the handle, ready for anything. The door creaked open with a soft push, and they entered. The stench of stale air and neglect hit them immediately. The living room was a mess. clothes scattered, broken furniture, and an overwhelming sense of decay. Jack's heart pounded. This wasn't just about saving the girl's mom anymore. There was something much darker at play. "Mom," the girl called out, her voice weak and strained. She ran toward a hallway that led deeper into the house. Jack followed closely, his senses on high alert. As they reached the end of the hallway, the girl stopped suddenly, her eyes widening with fear. There, behind a closed door, the faint sound of muffled cries could be heard. Jack stepped forward, his hand gripping the doorknob. It was locked. He glanced at the rest of the crew. "We need to get her out of there," he muttered. Now, a few of the bikers moved into position, keeping watch for anyone who might try to interfere. Meanwhile, Jack took a deep breath, then turned the doorknob. It didn't budge. With a swift motion, he kicked the door open. The sight before him was horrifying. The woman lay on the floor, her face bruised, her body limp. She was barely conscious, but still alive. Jack's heart sank as he rushed to her side. "She's been hurt bad," he said through gritted teeth. "We need to get her out of here, fast." As he checked for any signs of life, the girl stood beside him, watching in silence. The other bikers had spread out, searching the house for any signs of the man who had done this. Jack gently lifted the woman into his arms, careful not to cause her further pain. "We're getting you out of here," he whispered, "but we need to hurry." They moved quickly, the air thick with urgency. As they reached the front door, they heard a sound from behind them. A low, threatening voice. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jack turned slowly, his jaw tightening as he faced the man who had emerged from the shadows. The man was tall, his face hard and unforgiving, but there was something in his eyes, a coldness, a familiarity. Jack didn't hesitate. "We're taking her with us," he said firmly, "and you're not stopping us." The man's lips curled into a sneer. "You think you can just waltz in here and take her? You're making a big mistake." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Not as big as the mistake you made when you laid a hand on her." The tension in the air was palpable. The man stepped forward, his fists clenched. Jack was ready. He wasn't about to let this man threaten the girl's mother, not after everything she had been through. Just as the man lunged forward, a roar of motorcycle engines echoed in the distance. Jack's crew had positioned themselves outside, ready to back him up. The man froze, his eyes flicking toward the approaching sound. "You're outnumbered," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "And you don't want to do this." The man hesitated, then slowly backed away, his expression a mixture of rage and fear. Jack didn't waste any more time. "Get her to the bikes," he ordered. The bikers quickly moved into action, lifting the woman carefully and rushing her outside. Jack stayed behind for a moment, his eyes still locked on the man. "This isn't over," the man growled. "You'll pay for this." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. He was already walking toward the door, where his crew was waiting, ready to ride. As they made their way back to the bikes, the girl looked up at Jack with wide eyes. "Will she be okay?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. Jack gave her a reassuring smile. "We'll make sure of it," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing around them. The convoy of bikers revved their engines, ready for whatever came next. As they rode off into the night, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The fight wasn't over. But for now, they had done what they came for, saved a life, protected the innocent, and shown that no one, not even the darkest forces, would stand in their way. The convoy of bikers roared down the highway, their engines a constant reminder of the mission they were on. The woman Jack was holding on his bike had been stabilized, but the danger was far from over. He glanced back to see the other bikers riding in tight formation, their expressions grim, their eyes sharp with focus. The girl who had led them here, the one who had been the spark for everything, was riding behind him, clutching tightly to the back of his jacket. Her small hands shook with fear, but there was also a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Jack knew that hope wasn't enough. They had to make sure she stayed safe. As they neared the town, the silence between them felt unnatural. The bikers, usually loud and rowdy, were subdued, their minds preoccupied with the next steps. They had rescued the woman, but now they were facing a new threat, one they couldn't ignore. The man who had been holding her hostage, the one who had done this to her, wasn't going to let them walk away without a fight. Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the tension. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from one of his bikers. "We've got trouble." Someone's tailing us. Jack's jaw tightened. This was exactly what he had feared. The Serpents were on their trail, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. We can't let them get close, Jack muttered, his voice low but urgent. Stay sharp, everyone. We're almost there, but it's not over yet. The convoy picked up speed, the roar of their engines growing louder as they approached the edge of town. Jack knew they needed to get to a safe spot, fast. The bikers had trained for moments like this, but this wasn't just about getting away. This was about survival. The next few miles would determine everything. They reached a secluded area on the outskirts of town, an old warehouse district that Jack knew like the back of his hand. It was the perfect place to lay low, at least for a while. The bikers pulled in, their bikes humming as they parked in a tight circle. Jack helped the woman off his bike, her body still weak but responsive. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and exhaustion. Thank you, she whispered. You saved me. Jack gave her a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. It's not over yet, he said, his voice hard. We have to keep moving. The Serpents won't stop until they get what they want. The bikers immediately went to work, setting up lookout positions and making sure no one was following them. Jack's mind raced as he scanned the area, waiting for any signs of trouble. The woman was sitting on one of the crates, her head in her hands, tears silently falling down her face. Jack didn't know what kind of life she had before, but he knew it wasn't a good one. The girl who had led them here was standing beside her, trying to comfort her. Jack's eyes softened for a moment, but he quickly pushed the feeling aside. They had a job to do. The sound of an approaching car broke the silence, and the bikers immediately fell into position. Jack's heart raced as he listened to the rumbling of the engine, the tension in the air thickening. It wasn't the Serpents yet, but they weren't out of the woods. The car slowed down as it approached the warehouse, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Jack signaled to his crew, and they moved into place, preparing for whatever came next. The car stopped a few yards away, and Jack's heart skipped a beat when he saw who stepped out. It was the woman's husband, the one who had disappeared days ago. He looked disheveled, his clothes dirty, his face pale and drawn. Jack didn't trust him, not for a second. The man looked around, his eyes darting to the bikers standing at the ready. He was clearly on edge, but Jack wasn't going to take any chances. What do you want? Jack called out, his voice cold. The man froze, his eyes locking onto Jack's. There was a moment of silence, a long, heavy pause. Finally, the man spoke, his voice shaky but defiant. I want my wife, he said, his voice dripping with anger. Jack's jaw tightened. She's not going anywhere with you, he said firmly. The man took a step forward, his eyes wild with desperation. You don't know what you're dealing with, he said, his voice rising. You have no idea who I am. Jack narrowed his eyes. I know enough, he said, his tone low and dangerous. And I know you're not taking her anywhere. The standoff continued for what felt like an eternity. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Jack's mind raced, calculating his next move. He wasn't about to let this man take his wife and kid back into a life of abuse. Not on his watch. Finally, the man backed down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. You're making a mistake, he muttered, turning away. Jack watched him for a moment, then turned to his crew. Keep an eye on him, he ordered. He's not done yet. The bikers nodded, their eyes sharp. They knew this fight was far from over. But for now, they had done what they set out to do. They had protected the woman and her daughter. Jack knew the road ahead would be full of challenges, but he also knew one thing. No matter what, they would face it together. As they prepared to leave, the woman turned to Jack. What happens now? She asked softly. Jack looked down at her, his expression firm but compassionate. Now, we make sure you're safe, he said, and we deal with the rest when it comes. With that, the convoy of bikers revved their engines once again, ready to face whatever came next. The night had settled over the warehouse district like a heavy blanket, the silence only broken by the occasional hum of passing cars and the distant sounds of the city that never truly slept. Jack stood at the edge of the group, watching the woman and her daughter, who were now huddled together, trying to process everything that had just happened. They had moved from one dangerous situation to another, but now, at least for a moment, they were safe. Or so Jack hoped. His instincts told him that this was far from over. The man, her husband, the one who had abandoned them, wasn't going to give up so easily. Jack wasn't sure if the man was just desperate or if there was something darker lurking behind his actions. His mind raced as he looked out over the parking lot. The convoy of bikers had set up a temporary base, but their presence here wasn't going to go unnoticed for long. They had to move soon. The other bikers were talking in hushed voices, strategizing their next move. Jack walked over to them, his steps heavy with the weight of responsibility. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice low but firm. "The longer we stay here, the greater the chance they'll find us. We need to get them somewhere safe, somewhere they can stay hidden." The crew nodded in agreement, their eyes sharp and alert. They weren't just a group of bikers. They were a family, and they knew how to stick together when it counted. Jack turned to the woman, who was now standing with her daughter, her face still pale, but showing a hint of relief. "We're not going to leave you," Jack said softly. "But we can't stay here long. Do you have somewhere you can go?" The woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. But there was also something else, fear. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know where to go anymore. Everything's falling apart." Jack could see the panic in her eyes, and it made his heart ache. She wasn't just running from the man who had abused her. She was running from everything she had known. She had no place to call home. "We'll figure it out," Jack said, his voice steady. "You're not alone in this. We'll take care of you." The little girl, who had been silent for a while, looked up at Jack with wide, innocent eyes. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack knelt down in front of her, offering her a reassuring smile. "We're going to be just fine," he said, his tone soft but unwavering. "I promise." The girl nodded, seeming to take comfort in his words. But Jack wasn't sure if she fully understood the gravity of the situation. They had no idea what would come next, or how long it would take before the man or his associates came looking for them. The bikers had already begun to pack up, checking their gear and preparing for what was to come. Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "All right, listen up," he called out to the crew. "We need to head out now. We'll take the back roads, avoid the main highways. Stay low, stay quiet. We don't know how close they are, but we can't risk being spotted." The bikers moved swiftly, loading their bikes and getting into formation. Jack helped the woman onto his bike, then turned to the girl. "You're riding with me," he said, holding out a spare helmet. She nodded and climbed onto the back, clutching Jack tightly. The convoy of bikes roared to life as they took off, the rumble of their engines echoing through the empty streets. Jack's mind kept racing, going over every possible scenario. How long would it take for the man to realize they were gone? Would he try to track them down? And what would they do if the Serpents got involved? Jack knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he couldn't let them down. Not after everything they had been through. The convoy moved through the darkened streets, the headlights of their bikes cutting through the night like beams of light in the fog. They stuck to the back roads, weaving in and out of small towns and hidden paths, trying to remain unseen. The night was their cover, but Jack knew it wouldn't last forever. After what felt like hours, they reached a remote cabin hidden deep in the woods, far from the prying eyes of the city. It was secluded, peaceful, and safe, at least for now. Jack helped the woman and her daughter inside, where the rest of the crew began to set up camp. The cabin was small, but it had enough space for everyone to lay low for a while. Jack locked the door behind them and pulled the blinds, making sure there were no windows visible from the outside. He knew they couldn't stay here long, but for now, it would have to do. "We're safe for the night," Jack said, his voice firm. "But we need to be ready. This isn't over." As the others settled in, Jack sat near the door, keeping watch. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something they weren't prepared for. But for now, they had a moment of peace, and Jack would hold on to that. The woman sat down beside her daughter, the weight of the day finally starting to settle in. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Jack nodded. "We'll make sure you're okay. Just rest. We'll figure out the next steps tomorrow." But as Jack sat there in the silence, his mind raced. Tomorrow could bring anything, and he needed to be ready for whatever came next. The morning light filtered through the cracks of the cabin's wooden walls, casting long shadows across the floor. The silence in the room was only broken by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the soft breathing of the people who had spent the night in the small, isolated cabin. Jack sat by the window, his eyes scanning the forest outside, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The woman and her daughter were resting, but Jack knew they couldn't afford to stay too long. The danger hadn't passed. It was only a matter of time before the man who had caused all this, or someone from his network, came looking for them. As Jack stood up, the door creaked open behind him. One of the bikers, Diesel, entered with a grim look on his face. "We've got a problem," Diesel said quietly. Jack's heart sank. "What is it?" Diesel's face was hard, and his voice carried a hint of urgency. "I've been scouting around the area. I spotted 2 cars driving in circles around the cabin. They don't belong to any of us." Jack's fists clenched. It was exactly what he had feared. The man who had been behind all this, or someone working for him, had found their trail. They weren't safe here anymore. "We need to move," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "Now." Diesel nodded, already moving toward the door. Jack turned to the woman and her daughter, who had just woken up. The woman's eyes were still heavy with exhaustion, but there was a sense of relief in her gaze. She had found a moment of peace, but that peace was short-lived. "We need to leave," Jack said, walking over to her. "The situation's changed. It's not safe here anymore." The woman nodded, her face falling into a mask of worry. "But where will we go?" she asked softly. Jack looked at her, his expression steady. "I know a place. It's far off the grid. We can hide out there for a while." The girl, who had been sitting quietly by the window, suddenly spoke up. "Are we going to be okay?" Her voice was small, fragile, and it cut through Jack's resolve like a knife. He knelt down in front of her, offering a reassuring smile. "We're going to be just fine," he said. "But we need to stick together. You trust me, don't you?" The girl nodded, her eyes wide with trust. Jack stood and turned to his crew, who were already preparing to leave. "Get the bikes ready. We'll take the back roads again. No one is following us. Let's keep it that way." The bikers moved swiftly, their usual ease now replaced by the tension of knowing they were on the run. Jack helped the woman and her daughter onto his bike, making sure they were both secure before revving the engine. "Hold on tight," he told the girl. "We're getting out of here." The convoy roared to life, the engines rumbling in unison as they sped down the dirt road. Jack's eyes never left the rearview mirror. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The back roads stretched out before them, winding through thick forests and empty fields. But Jack knew the moment they hit the open highway, they would be exposed. They had to keep moving. As they neared the edge of town, Jack's instinct screamed that something was off. The sky was clouding over, a storm was coming, and it felt like more than just the weather. Something was out there, lurking, waiting. He glanced over at Diesel, who was riding close behind him. Diesel's expression was tense, his eyes darting from side to side. Jack knew Diesel well enough to know that if Diesel was on edge, they were in trouble. "What is it?" Jack called out, his voice carrying over the roar of the engines. Diesel's answer was short, his voice strained. "There's a black SUV behind us. It's been tailing us for miles." Jack's heart rate spiked. He knew exactly who would be driving that SUV, someone from the Serpents. The moment the Serpents found them, it would be over. They couldn't let that happen. "We have to lose them," Jack said, his voice low and commanding. "Take the next left. We'll cut through the woods." The convoy followed his command without hesitation, swerving off the road and into the thick forest. The sound of tires crunching on dirt and branches scraping against the bikes filled the air. Jack's bike handled the rough terrain with ease, but he knew they couldn't keep up this pace for long. The trees closed in around them, blocking their view of the road behind. Jack could only hope that the SUV would lose them in the maze of trees. They rode for miles, the sun dipping lower in the sky as the storm. Clouds thickened above them. Jack's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. The Serpents weren't just going to back off. They were relentless. Jack needed to get the woman and her daughter to safety. But how could he do that when every road he took seemed to lead to more danger? As they reached a clearing, Jack stopped, his bike cutting off with a growl of the engine. The others followed suit, and the convoy came to a halt in the middle of the forest. Jack turned to his crew, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We're not running anymore. We're going to take a stand." He turned to the woman, who was sitting behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around the girl. "You stay here, keep low, and don't make a sound. We'll take care of everything." The woman nodded, her face pale but resolute. Jack signaled to the bikers to set up a defensive perimeter. The air was thick with tension as the storm clouds gathered overhead, and Jack knew that the Serpents wouldn't be far behind. But this time, they were ready. The storm was closing in fast, the sky darkening with ominous clouds. As Jack stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes scanning the horizon. The silence of the woods was thick, broken only by the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. It felt like the calm before the storm, and Jack could feel it in his gut. Something was coming. The Serpents weren't far behind, and Jack knew they would stop at nothing to take the woman and her daughter back. He wasn't going to let that happen. He turned to Diesel, who was crouched low by a tree, his eyes sharp, scanning their surroundings. "Anything?" Jack asked, his voice low but urgent. Diesel shook his head, his jaw tight. "Not yet. But they're close. I can feel it." Jack nodded. He trusted Diesel's instincts. The rest of the bikers had taken up defensive positions, hiding in the shadows, weapons ready. This was the moment they had been preparing for. Jack motioned for them to spread out, keeping a close eye on the woman and her daughter, who were hidden behind the trees, waiting for the chaos to unfold. "Stay low," Jack reminded them, his voice steady but laced with tension. "We can't afford to get careless now." The wind picked up, and Jack's mind raced. He had no illusions about the situation. The Serpents weren't just going to walk away. They had to be ready for a fight, one that could escalate quickly. He checked his own gear, making sure everything was in place, his fingers brushing over the worn leather of his vest. His crew was ready. The woman and her daughter were counting on them. Jack wasn't going to fail them. A sudden noise snapped him out of his thoughts. Footsteps. Someone was approaching. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He looked at Diesel, who gave him a quick, silent signal. "They're here," Diesel muttered. The sound of tires on dirt reached Jack's ears, faint at first, but growing louder by the second. "Get ready," Jack said, his voice low and commanding. He could hear the rumble of the engine, the unmistakable sound of a vehicle cutting through the forest. The Serpents were here. The bikers shifted into position, their muscles tense, ready for anything. Jack felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as the car came closer, its headlights cutting through the trees like a predator closing in on its prey. Jack held his breath, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The car came into view, slowly creeping around the bend, the headlights briefly illuminating the dark, shadowy figures of the bikers. Jack's grip tightened on his handlebars, his eyes never leaving the car. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. The Serpents had arrived. But Jack wasn't intimidated. He had dealt with people like them before. The car stopped just short of the clearing, the engine idling as the figure inside the vehicle looked around, scanning the woods. Jack knew it wasn't the leader of the Serpents. He could tell by the way the man moved, the way he held himself. This was just one of their muscle, someone sent to track them down. The biker crew, silent and still, waited for Jack's signal. He didn't hesitate. With a sharp motion, he raised his hand, signaling the attack. In an instant, the air was filled with the roar of engines as the bikers charged forward, their bikes cutting through the night like thunder. Jack was in the front, his bike leading the charge as he sped toward the car, the headlights blinding in the darkness. The Serpent's muscle barely had time to react as Jack's crew surrounded him, the bikers moving like a well-oiled machine. The man in the car scrambled, trying to reach for his gun, but it was too late. Jack was on him, his fists connecting with the man's face, sending him sprawling to the ground. The rest of the bikers quickly dealt with the others, their movements swift and precise. Within moments, the Serpents were on the ground, unable to move, their weapons taken away, their power stripped. Jack stood over the man, breathing heavily, his eyes cold as he stared down at him. "You made a big mistake coming here," Jack said, his voice low and filled with menace. The man spat blood onto the dirt, his face twisted in pain. "You won't get away with this," he growled. Jack knelt down, his face inches from the man's. "You should have thought about that before you laid a hand on an innocent woman and child." The man's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and defiance, but Jack wasn't going to let him get away. Not this time. "Get him out of here," Jack ordered. Two of the bikers grabbed the man, dragging him away from the clearing. Jack watched them go, his heart still pounding in his chest. But they weren't done yet. The fight wasn't over. "Stay alert," Jack said to the crew, his voice sharp and commanding. "This isn't over. They'll be back." The bikers nodded, their expressions grim. Jack turned to the woman and her daughter, who had been watching from the edge of the clearing. The woman was visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she hugged her daughter tightly. Jack walked over to them, his expression softening. "You're safe for now," he said, his voice low. But we can't stay here much longer. We need to keep moving. The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Jack gave her a reassuring smile. But inside, he knew the road ahead was still dangerous. The serpents wouldn't give up easily. We'll make sure you're safe, Jack said, his voice firm. We'll keep moving. But you're not alone. Not anymore. The bikers began to gather their things, preparing to leave. Jack felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in a long while, it felt like they were making a difference. But he knew better than to get complacent. This was far from over. The air was thick with tension as the bikers prepared to leave the clearing, their engines rumbling softly, the calm before the storm. Jack's mind was racing. He had thought the fight was over, that the serpents had been dealt with, but something in his gut told him this wasn't the end. He stood near the edge of the clearing, watching the woman and her daughter, still clinging to each other, the fear in their eyes palpable. Jack had done everything in his power to protect them, but he knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. We need to get to higher ground, he said to his crew, his voice steady but laced with urgency. If we stay here, we'll be sitting ducks. We'll head to the ridge and lay low until we figure out what's next. Diesel, his right-hand man, nodded and moved quickly to gather the crew. They were a tight-knit group, each one skilled and experienced, but Jack knew that no matter how good they were, the serpents were dangerous. They had no idea what they were up against. As they moved toward the ridge, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He looked over his shoulder, scanning the trees, the darkening sky above. The storm was getting closer, but it wasn't the weather that had him on edge. The serpents were still out there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jack's mind raced through every possible scenario. If they were going to survive, they needed to stay ahead of them. The group made its way up the ridge, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. As they reached the top, Jack stopped and turned to face his crew. Stay alert, he said. We need to be ready for anything. The bikers spread out, taking positions around the perimeter. Jack's eyes stayed on the woman and her daughter, making sure they were safe. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for them. They had come so far, but the danger wasn't over yet. The storm was now right on top of them, the wind howling through the trees. Jack could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the sense of urgency mounting. They couldn't afford to stay here for long. Just as he turned to speak to Diesel, the sound of distant engines cut through. The howling wind. Jack's heart skipped a beat. They're back, Diesel said, his voice tight with tension. Jack didn't hesitate. Get the bikes ready. We're moving out now. The bikers scrambled into action, their movements swift and practiced. Jack didn't look back as he mounted his bike, his mind focused on what needed to be done. They had no time to waste. The convoy of bikers revved their engines, the roar of their bikes echoing in the distance as they sped down the ridge. Jack's instincts told him to take the back roads, to avoid the main highways where the serpents could be waiting. The convoy followed Jack's lead, weaving through the dense woods, their headlights cutting through the darkness like a trail of light. The night was cold, and the storm was picking up speed, but Jack's focus remained sharp. He couldn't afford to lose the serpents. They had to stay one step ahead. The convoy sped through the woods, the wind whipping past them as they navigated the winding paths. Jack could feel the weight of the woman and her daughter on his mind, the responsibility of keeping them safe, pushing him forward. He knew that no matter what, he couldn't let them down. They had to make it out of this alive. As they reached a fork in the road, Jack slowed down, scanning the area for any signs of danger. The trees were dense, the darkness making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Jack's heart raced as he listened for any sounds of pursuit. The serpents had to be close. He could feel it in his bones. Just as he was about to give the signal to move forward, a shadow appeared in the distance. A figure on a bike, riding fast, closing the gap. Jack's breath caught in his throat. It's them, he muttered. Get ready. The figure on the bike was fast, too fast. Jack's instincts kicked in as he revved his engine and shot forward, pushing his bike to its limits. The convoy followed, their bikes roaring to life as they sped down the road, trying to outrun the figure tailing them. Jack's heart raced as the figure drew closer. It was the leader of the serpents, and he wasn't going to stop until he had what he wanted. Jack's mind raced as he considered his options. He could try to lose him, but the terrain was too tricky, the storm too fierce. They had to face him head-on. Jack swerved, cutting off the figure's path, forcing him to slow down. The biker leader didn't hesitate. He revved his engine and charged forward, his eyes locked on Jack. The two bikers collided, the sound of metal scraping against metal filling the air as they fought for control. Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars, his body tense as he fought to maintain his position. The convoy was close behind, but Jack knew this was a fight they couldn't avoid. The leader of the Serpents was dangerous, ruthless, and Jack had no intention of letting him get the upper hand. They were locked in a battle, each one trying to outmaneuver the other. Jack's muscles burned with effort, but he held his ground. The woman and her daughter were depending on him, and he wasn't going to back down now. As the leader made another attempt to knock him off course, Jack knew it was now or never. With a swift turn of the throttle, Jack cut in front of the leader, his bike pushing forward with all its might. The leader swerved, trying to regain control, but it was too late. Jack's bike shot ahead, leaving the Serpent leader behind. The convoy surged forward, the sound of their bikes echoing through the woods as they pushed on, leaving the danger behind them, for now. Jack didn't look back. The storm was still raging, the road ahead uncertain, but one thing was clear: they weren't done yet. The rain came down harder as the convoy of bikers pushed forward, their headlights cutting through the storm like beacons in the dark. The tension in the air was palpable, every biker on high alert, eyes scanning the road ahead, hearts racing with the knowledge that they weren't out of danger yet. Jack was leading the pack, his mind sharp as a knife, never letting his guard down. The sound of the rain hitting the pavement, mixed with the hum of the engines, filled the air as they sped down the back roads, trying to keep their distance from the Serpents. They had outrun them for now, but Jack knew it wasn't over. The fight was just beginning. They needed a safe place to regroup, to plan their next move. Jack glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes flicking over the convoy behind him. Diesel was close, his bike roaring through the rain like a beast, followed by the rest of the crew. The woman and her daughter were riding in the middle, clinging to each other for support, their faces pale but determined. Jack's heart went out to them, but he couldn't afford to focus on that now. They had to stay ahead of the Serpents, or all of this would be for nothing. He took a sharp turn onto a narrow dirt road, his tires kicking up mud and gravel as the rest of the crew followed. The trees on either side were thick, blocking out much of the rain, but Jack knew this was the only way they'd stay hidden for a while. The storm was their cover, but it wouldn't last forever. They needed a plan. As they reached the end of the dirt road, Jack slowed down, his eyes scanning the area. It was an abandoned cabin in the woods, remote, hidden from the main roads, and just what they needed to lay low for a while. Jack signaled to the crew, and they pulled in, their bikes coming to a halt one by one. The rain was pouring down now, soaking them to the bone, but they didn't have time to waste. They needed to set up a perimeter and figure out their next move. Jack helped the woman and her daughter off his bike, his eyes briefly meeting hers. There was a look of gratitude in her eyes, but also fear. She knew, just like Jack did, that the danger wasn't over. "Stay inside," Jack said to her, his voice steady. "We'll keep watch." The woman nodded, her grip tightening on her daughter's hand. Jack turned to Diesel, who was already setting up a lookout at the edge of the clearing. "We need eyes on the road," Jack said. "The Serpents are going to be looking for us, and we need to know when they're close." Diesel gave a quick nod, and the rest of the crew spread out, each one taking a position, ready to protect the cabin at all costs. Jack knew this wasn't the safest place, but it was all they had for now. The sound of the rain outside grew louder, but inside the cabin, there was only the sound of their breathing and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Jack looked around the small, dimly lit room, his mind racing with thoughts of what came next. The woman and her daughter were sitting in the corner, trying to keep warm, their eyes filled with uncertainty. Jack couldn't blame them. They were in the middle of nowhere, with a group of dangerous men on their trail, and no clear way out. He needed to figure out how to get them to safety, but first, they had to survive the night. He walked over to the small window, peering outside into the darkness. The rain was coming down in sheets now, making it nearly impossible to see anything past the edge of the trees. Jack's mind was still racing, his thoughts jumping from one scenario to the next. What if the Serpents found them? What if they tried to attack the cabin? What if they couldn't outrun them? He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. The last thing they needed was panic. "We can't let them get to us," Jack muttered to himself. He turned away from the window and walked over to the woman, who was sitting on the floor with her daughter. "You're safe here for now," he said, his voice low but firm. "But we can't stay long. We need to move at first light." The woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. "What if they find us?" she whispered. Jack crouched down in front of her, offering her a reassuring smile. "We'll deal with that when the time comes," he said. "Right now, you need to rest. We'll keep watch." The woman nodded, but Jack could see the worry still etched on her face. He didn't blame her. The last few days had been a nightmare for her, and now they were in the middle of a storm with no way of knowing what the next day would bring. But Jack knew they had no choice. They had to keep moving, keep fighting. The Serpents weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. Jack stood up, his eyes scanning the cabin once more. It was small, dark, and cold, but it was the best they could do for now. He walked over to the door, checking the lock one more time before turning to Diesel, who was standing by the window, keeping watch. "We need to stay sharp," Jack said, his voice steady. "Tomorrow, we make our move. For now, we rest." Diesel nodded, his eyes never leaving the road. Jack knew they would make it through the night, but the real challenge was still ahead. The Serpents would be back, and when they did, Jack would be ready. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time Jack's crew finished setting up their temporary camp. The cabin was small, dark, and cold, but it was still their best option for the night. Jack stood near the window, his mind racing. The Serpents had to be getting close. He could feel it in his bones. The storm had given them a small window of safety, but it wasn't going to last long. His eyes scanned the trees outside, searching for any signs of movement. There was a rustle in the distance, but it was just the wind. He let out a slow breath and turned back to the cabin. The woman and her daughter were resting on the floor, trying to stay warm. The little girl had fallen asleep, her head resting on her mother's lap, while the woman sat there, wide awake, her eyes filled with worry. Jack could see the exhaustion in her face, but he also saw something else, determination. They had come this far, and they weren't about to give up now. He walked over to them, crouching down beside the woman. "We'll be ready to move in the morning," he said, his voice steady. "But for now, get some rest. We'll keep watch." The woman nodded, but Jack could tell she wasn't fully reassured. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Jack gave her a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're not done yet," he said softly. "We'll make sure you're safe. That's what we do." Jack stood up and turned to Diesel, who was sitting by the door, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "You good?" Jack asked. Diesel nodded, his face grim. "We're fine for now, but we need to stay sharp. They'll come looking for us, sooner or later." Jack knew Diesel was right. The Serpents were relentless. They would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Jack's mind was already working on their next move. They couldn't stay here forever. They needed to get out of the woods, find a more secure place to hide. But where? The woman and her daughter couldn't keep running forever. They needed a permanent solution, and fast. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, a crackling noise from the radio. He walked over to the makeshift table where the rest of the crew was gathered. "What's going on?" he asked. One of the bikers, Wrench, was sitting with the radio, listening intently. "I'm hearing something," Wrench said, his voice low. "Could be the Serpents. They're on the move." Jack's heart skipped a beat. The timing was too perfect. The Serpents couldn't have found them this quickly, could they? He turned to the crew. "Get ready," he said. "We need to move now." The bikers immediately started preparing, checking their gear, making sure everything was in place. Jack grabbed his helmet and walked over to the woman. "We need to leave," he said, his voice urgent. "It's too dangerous here." The woman looked up, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack didn't have all the answers, but he had to get them out of here. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "We'll find a safe place. I promise." He turned to Diesel. "You take the front, I'll cover the back." Diesel nodded, already heading toward the door. Jack followed him, his eyes scanning the trees as he stepped outside. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with tension. Every movement felt amplified, every sound a potential threat. They couldn't afford to be careless. They had to stay ahead of the Serpents. The convoy of bikers revved their engines, the sound echoing through the woods as they prepared to leave. Jack looked back at the cabin, making sure the woman and her daughter were ready. The little girl was awake now, clinging to her mother, her eyes wide with fear. Jack's heart went out to her, but there was no time to waste. "Stay close," he said to the woman, his voice soft but firm. "We're getting out of here." The convoy started moving, the bikes kicking up dirt and mud as they made their way down the narrow trail. Jack led the group, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. He knew the serpents were close, and he wasn't about to let them catch up. As they rode through the woods, the sound of their engines filled the air, a steady rhythm that was both reassuring and dangerous. They were on the move, but they still weren't out of the woods yet. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The trees seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening as the night grew darker. The convoy picked up speed, the road ahead growing more treacherous with every turn. The rain had made the dirt road slippery, and Jack had to keep his focus sharp to avoid any obstacles. "We need to find higher ground," he said to Diesel, his voice tight with urgency. "Get us somewhere we can see what's coming." Diesel nodded, signaling to the rest of the crew to follow his lead. The convoy made a sharp turn, heading up a steep incline toward the ridge. As they reached the top, Jack stopped, looking out over the valley below. The view was clear, but there was still no sign of the serpents. For now, they were safe. But Jack knew it wouldn't last. The serpents would be on them soon. He turned to Diesel, his expression grim. "Keep watch," he said. "We're not staying long." As the bikers set up a temporary camp, Jack kept his eyes on the horizon. He knew this was just the beginning. The real fight was still to come. The night had fallen completely, the storm continuing to rage around them, but Jack's crew remained vigilant. They had found higher ground, a rocky ridge that provided a clear view of the surrounding area, but the ominous feeling in the air remained. Jack stood at the edge of the ridge, his eyes scanning the dark forest below. The convoy had settled in for the night, but their safety was far from guaranteed. The serpents had been relentless, and Jack knew they wouldn't give up easily. "We need to keep moving," Jack muttered to himself, more to reassure his own thoughts than anyone else. He turned back to the rest of the group. "No one sleeps yet. Stay alert." Diesel, always the one to watch the perimeter, nodded and moved further down the ridge, his eyes constantly moving, scanning for any signs of movement. Jack watched him for a moment before turning to check on the woman and her daughter, who were sitting by the fire. The little girl curled up in her mother's arms. The woman looked exhausted, her eyes red from lack of sleep and the overwhelming stress she had been under for days. Jack approached them, his voice softer now. "How are you holding up?" he asked. The woman looked up at him, her expression weary but grateful. "We're okay," she said quietly. "Just tired. I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this." Jack gave her a reassuring smile, though he knew there was no easy answer. "You're doing fine. We're going to get you through this. Just hang in there." The woman nodded, but Jack could see the doubt in her eyes. She wasn't convinced. And honestly, Jack wasn't sure either. He turned away, knowing there was little comfort he could offer right now. They had to survive the night first. As he walked back toward the rest of the bikers, his mind raced with options. They couldn't stay here long. The serpents would be closing in. They needed to keep moving, but where? The woman and her daughter couldn't keep running forever. He needed a permanent solution, and fast. Diesel approached him, his face grim. "I've been keeping watch," Diesel said. "I don't like it, Jack. We're exposed up here. If the serpents send more men, we'll be sitting ducks." Jack nodded, his jaw tight. He knew Diesel was right. The higher ground was good for observation, but it left them vulnerable. "We'll move at first light," Jack said, his voice firm. "We'll take a different route, try to double back. We need to throw them off our trail." Diesel gave a quick nod. "I'll start preparing the bikes." Jack walked over to his own bike, checking his gear, his mind focused on the task at hand. As he inspected the motorcycle, a distant sound caught his attention. A faint rumbling in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. He looked up sharply, his instincts kicking in. The sound grew louder. It was the unmistakable sound of engines. "They're here," Jack said quietly to himself, his pulse quickening. He turned to Diesel. "Get everyone ready." Now, the convoy scrambled into action, the bikers quickly moving to their positions, weapons ready. Jack felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as the rumbling grew louder. They didn't have much time. He looked back at the woman and her daughter, who were now standing, ready to move. "Stay close," Jack ordered, his voice low and steady. "We're getting out of here." The engines roared to life as the convoy moved swiftly, the sound of their bikes cutting through the night like a warning. Jack led the way, his mind focused, every sense heightened. He knew the serpents were close, but he couldn't afford to look back now. They had to stay ahead. As they sped through the dense forest, the headlights of their bikes illuminated the path ahead, but Jack's mind was focused on the shadows. The serpents could be anywhere. They had to be ready for anything. They kept a steady pace, weaving through the trees, the bikes humming with power as they navigated the winding trails. Jack's eyes never left the road ahead. The tension was palpable. He could feel the presence of the serpents like a weight pressing down on him. They were getting closer. Jack's gut twisted with unease. He knew the serpents wouldn't give up this easily. They had already shown their persistence. But Jack wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when they were so close. The road opened up ahead, a stretch of open land that led toward a small town in the distance. Jack glanced back to make sure the convoy was still in formation. Diesel was right behind him, his eyes scanning the surroundings. They needed to get through this open stretch quickly. If the serpents were coming, this was the moment they would strike. The convoy picked up speed, racing toward the town, but as they neared the outskirts, the sound of engines behind them grew louder. Jack's heart skipped a beat. They were closing in fast. He had to make a decision. Turn left, Jack ordered sharply. Cut through the woods. We'll take the back route into town. The convoy swerved, turning sharply off the road and into the woods. The bikes rumbled as they tore through the trees, the sound of their engines a distant growl as they moved deeper into the forest. Jack's mind raced. He couldn't let them get caught. They had to stay one step ahead of the serpents. As they navigated the narrow trail, Jack's eyes searched the shadows. The trees were dense here, and the rain had made the ground slick. The path was difficult, but they had no choice. Jack pushed forward, the convoy following close behind, but he could feel the pressure building. The serpents were right behind them. They had to make it to the town. They couldn't stop now. The convoy of bikers continued to race through the thick woods, their engines roaring as they cut through the dense trees. Jack's mind was sharp, his eyes darting between the winding path ahead and the rearview mirror. He could hear the rumbling of the serpents' engines growing louder, closing in on them. He pushed his bike harder, urging it forward, knowing they didn't have much time before the serpents caught up. The trail was narrow, but it was their only option now. The town was too far ahead, and the serpents were too close behind. Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars, his thoughts racing. They had to lose them in the woods, or they were done for. The woman and her daughter were riding behind him, clinging to each other for comfort, their fear palpable. Jack's heart went out to them, but he couldn't afford to think about that now. They had to focus on survival. Diesel, riding beside him, gave him a quick glance. "They're gaining," Diesel shouted over the roar of the bikes. Jack nodded grimly. "Take the lead," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to make a sharp turn up ahead. It's a long shot, but it's the only way we might lose them." Diesel's eyes narrowed, and without a word, he veered off the path, accelerating toward a break in the trees that Jack had spotted earlier. The rest of the convoy followed, the sound of their engines becoming a distant thrum as they took the sharp turn. Jack held his breath as they entered a thick patch of trees. It was a risky move, but it was their only shot at evading the serpents. He could hear the crackle of branches and the growl of engines behind them, but he didn't dare look back. Every second counted. The trees were densely packed now, the path barely wide enough for the bikes to fit. Jack's mind raced, but he couldn't afford to let his focus slip. His eyes darted ahead, looking for any sign of danger, any sign that the serpents were still close. He didn't want to risk a head-on confrontation. The sound of their pursuit was still there, faint but growing stronger. Jack knew it wouldn't be long before they caught up. He had to think fast. He glanced at Diesel, who was taking the lead now, his bike cutting through the trees like a knife. The convoy followed closely, each biker riding with precision, knowing they had to stick together if they were going to make it out of this. Jack pushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest as the woods seemed to close in on them. The trees were thick, the path winding and treacherous, but he kept his eyes forward. The serpents were behind, but they couldn't afford to look back. The sound of the engines faded into the background as Jack focused on the road ahead. He knew it was only a matter of time before they hit a clearing. And when they did, it would be their final stand. The bikes ripped through the woods, the riders pushing their machines to the limit. Jack's thoughts were clear now. He had to keep them moving, keep the serpents guessing. Every turn they made, every move they took, needed to be calculated. He had one shot at this. The sound of the serpents' bikes grew louder again, too close for comfort. Jack's pulse quickened. They were coming. The clearing was up ahead. As they reached it, Jack slowed down, his bike gliding into the wide open space. The rest of the convoy followed, and they stopped in the middle of the clearing, engines idling. Jack's eyes scanned the perimeter, his body tense as he waited. The serpents would be here any second. Diesel pulled up beside him, his eyes scanning the trees. "We're not alone," Diesel muttered. "They're close. We need a plan." Jack nodded, his mind working fast. "We've got nowhere to run now," he said, his voice low but firm. "We're going to fight, but we do it on our terms. Get into position. Keep the women hidden." The bikers immediately spread out, taking cover behind trees and rocks, ready for the fight. Jack positioned himself at the center of the clearing, his hand on the hilt of his knife, ready to defend. He could feel the tension in the air, the heaviness of the moment. The serpents weren't just going to let them go. They would fight to the end, and Jack was ready for it. The sound of engines grew louder once more, the rumbling. Getting closer. Jack's heart raced as he prepared for the confrontation. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. The serpents would come in force, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But Jack had a plan, and he wasn't about to back down. The trees at the edge of the clearing parted, and the first of the serpents' bikes appeared, cutting through the night like a shadow. The leader of the serpents was riding in the front, his face twisted with anger, his eyes cold as they locked onto Jack. "This is it," Jack said, his voice steady, his eyes focused. "Get ready." The rest of the serpents followed, their bikes kicking up dirt as they surrounded the clearing. Jack's grip tightened around his knife, his mind calculating every move. The battle for their survival had begun. The serpents were closing in, their bikes roaring as they surrounded the clearing. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he stood, unmoving, in the center of the open space, his eyes locked on the leader of the serpents, who was riding at the front of the pack. The leader's face was filled with rage, his eyes burning with a cold, dangerous fury. Jack could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was the showdown he had been preparing for. The serpents were not just a threat to his crew. They were a threat to the woman and her daughter, and Jack wasn't going to let them win. He glanced at his crew, each one of them taking their positions, their weapons ready. Diesel was on one side, his eyes sharp, watching for any sign of movement. Wrench, another member of the crew, was crouched behind a large rock, his rifle aimed at the group of approaching serpents. The rest of the bikers had spread out, using the trees and the terrain for cover. "We fight on our terms," Jack said under his breath, his hand tightening around the hilt of his knife. The serpent leader's voice cut through the tension, a cruel, mocking laugh escaping his lips. "You really think you can stand against us? We'll take her, and we'll take you down with her," he shouted, his voice echoing through the clearing. Jack's grip on his knife tightened, but he didn't flinch. He had been in battles before, and he wasn't about to back down now. "Not today," Jack said, his voice calm, but his words laced with a promise of destruction. The serpents advanced, their bikes growling like beasts. Jack's heart raced, but his mind was clear. This was it. There was no more running. The fight had come to them. Jack stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the leader of the serpents. The leader smirked, motioning for his men to charge. It was like a slow-motion moment. The serpents revved their engines, ready to attack, but Jack was faster. He darted to the side, his body moving with the fluidity of years of experience. The first serpent reached him, but Jack was already on him, his knife flashing in the moonlight. With a swift motion, he disarmed the attacker, sending the man sprawling to the ground. The serpent leader's eyes widened in surprise. "You think you can take us all down?" he yelled, clearly shocked by Jack's speed and precision. Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. The serpents were underestimating him. They were about to learn that mistake. The first few bikers tried to close in on him, but Diesel was there, taking them out with a quick, brutal efficiency. The rest of the crew was moving fast, their coordinated strikes making quick work of the serpents. Jack fought with purpose, each movement calculated, every strike landing with precision. The fight was chaotic, but Jack was in control. The leader of the serpents seemed to realize that this wasn't going as planned. He ordered his men to regroup, but it was too late. Jack was already upon him. The serpent leader's eyes narrowed as he revved his engine, charging straight for Jack, but Jack was faster. With one fluid motion, Jack darted to the side, then lunged forward, grabbing the leader by the collar and slamming him into the dirt. The serpent leader gasped, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Jack's face was inches from his, and he could feel the leader's fear. "You've lost," Jack said coldly, his voice a low growl. The leader struggled, trying to break free, but Jack held him firm. "You're done." The serpent leader sneered, his lip curled in defiance. "This isn't over. You can't stop us," he spat, his voice shaking with rage. Jack pressed his knee into the leader's chest, his grip tightening. "It's over for you," Jack replied. With a swift motion, Jack knocked the leader unconscious, his body going limp. The remaining serpents hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do now that their leader was down. Jack stood, breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the remaining attackers. The fight had been fierce, but the serpents were no match for the bikers. They were done. The remaining serpents backed off, their bikes roaring to life as they retreated into the night. Jack watched them go, his heart still racing, but his mind already moving forward. The battle was won, but there was still work to be done. The woman and her daughter were safe, for now. But Jack knew this wouldn't be the last time they faced the serpents. He turned to Diesel, who was walking toward him, a grim expression on his face. "You think they'll come back?" Diesel asked, his voice low. Jack nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. "They'll be back, but we'll be ready for them." Jack turned to the woman and her daughter, who were standing a little further away. The woman's eyes were filled with gratitude, but Jack saw the lingering fear in her gaze. He walked over to them, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You're safe," Jack said softly. "But we can't stay here long. We need to keep moving." The woman nodded, her expression tense, but there was relief in her eyes. Jack knew it wasn't over. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like they had a fighting chance. The bikers gathered around him, their expressions hard, their resolve clear. Jack could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders, but he knew they had done the right thing. "We ride at first light," Jack said, his voice steady. "We get them to safety, and we don't look back." The crew nodded in unison. Jack could feel the unspoken bond between them, their loyalty, their strength. They had fought together, and they would fight again. And when the serpents came for them next, they would be ready. The next morning, the fog still clung to the trees as Jack and his crew prepared to leave the clearing. The storm had passed, but its remnants hung in the air, thick, heavy, and ominous. The convoy of bikers moved in silence, each one deep in thought as they readied their bikes, the weight of the previous night's fight still hanging over them. Jack's mind was racing. They had defeated the serpents, but he knew this wasn't the end. The woman and her daughter had found temporary safety, but the danger wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Jack approached the woman and her daughter, who were standing at the edge of the clearing, their faces drawn with exhaustion but marked by quiet relief. They had made it through the night, but the look in the woman's eyes told Jack everything he needed to know. They were still running, still hiding, and it was only a matter of time before the serpents came after them again. "We need to keep moving," Jack said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. The woman nodded, her hand tightening around her daughter's. Jack knew this wasn't easy for her. They had been through hell, and yet they were still standing. But Jack wasn't sure how much longer they could outrun the serpents. They needed a plan, and fast. The convoy revved their engines, the sound of the bikes cutting through the stillness of the forest. Jack took the lead again, Diesel and the rest of the crew following close behind. They rode through the woods, the trees lining the road like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the morning breeze. Jack's eyes were scanning the road ahead, his mind calculating their next move. They couldn't stay on the main roads for long, not with the serpents still looking for them. Jack needed to find a way to get them out of this. He glanced back at the woman and her daughter, who were riding behind him. They were safe for now, but Jack knew that could change in an instant. The woman caught his eye and gave him a small, grateful smile. Jack nodded in return, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was no time for gratitude. They had to get to safety. The convoy pushed forward, winding their way through the dense woods, taking back roads and hidden trails. The engines roared as they raced through the forest, the sound of the bikes echoing in the distance. Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars. Every instinct in him told him they were being watched. The serpents had to be close. The road ahead suddenly opened up into a clearing, a small town visible in the distance. Jack slowed down his eyes, scanning the area. The town was a few miles away, but they needed to be careful. The serpents had spies everywhere. They couldn't afford to be seen. Jack made a decision. "We're cutting through the town," he said, his voice sharp. "We'll lay low and get to the other side. Stay close, keep your heads down." The convoy veered off the trail, heading toward the outskirts of the town. The small, quiet streets were empty, the buildings closed up for the night. Jack led the crew through the town, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign of trouble. As they passed through the last street, Jack's heart skipped a beat. There, standing at the corner of the street, was a familiar face. The leader of the Serpents. Jack's instincts kicked in. He motioned for the convoy to stop. "Get ready," he whispered, his voice low and steady. "We're not alone." The bikers quickly took cover, their eyes locked on the serpent leader, who was now walking toward them. Jack's mind raced. They had to take him out before he could call for reinforcements. This was their chance. The serpent leader stopped just a few feet away from Jack, his eyes narrowing as he recognized him. "You're a fool," the leader sneered. "You think you can outrun us? You think you can hide from the serpents?" Jack stepped forward, his face cold. "You're done," he said, his voice unwavering. "This ends now." The serpent leader laughed, his eyes wild with rage. "You think you can stop me? You have no idea what you're up against." Jack didn't hesitate. With a quick motion, he drew his knife and lunged, catching the leader off guard. The fight was over in seconds. The serpent leader crumpled to the ground, unable to fight back. Jack stood over him, breathing heavily, his eyes hard as stone. He had done what needed to be done, but there was still so much more to be done. The serpents wouldn't give up that easily. Jack turned to the crew, who were now standing behind him, weapons at the ready. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Get the woman and her daughter. We're moving out." The convoy quickly regrouped, the bikers moving swiftly to the woman and her daughter, who were still waiting in the distance. The woman's face was filled with a mixture of relief and fear, but Jack knew they couldn't let their guard down yet. The serpents may have lost their leader, but they were still a powerful force, and Jack wasn't sure how long it would take before they retaliated. As the convoy revved their engines and prepared to leave, Jack looked around one last time. He knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but they were still alive. They had made it this far, and they weren't going to stop now. With one last glance at the town, Jack signaled for the crew to move out. The bikes roared to life as they raced down the road, disappearing into the distance. Jack's eyes stayed focused on the road ahead, knowing that the fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like they had a chance. The serpents had underestimated them, and Jack wasn't about to let them forget that.